in our Gospels, we have a passage in John's Gospel, John 4, where Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at the well. Do you want to tell that story, since I did Adam and Eve? Or
Sure. And then I wouldn't mind making a comment about it afterwards. So Jesus comes to the well, and we are told that this is the well that is identified in Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, as Jacob's well. And Jesus arrives at the well. He's thirsty. He has, unlike, I guess, my assumption, which was there would always be some kind of a bucket or something at a well that people could draw from. There was nothing. You bring your own device to draw water, and he didn't have one. So he is sitting at the well, and the Samaritan woman shows up, and he asks her for a drink. He actually, according to our scriptures, basically demands, but he says, "Give me a drink." That's the first thing he does. Now, he's speaking to a woman who he's not supposed to be speaking to. He's doing this in public. It's someone he doesn't know. And she is a Samaritan woman. So traditionally at that time, Jewish people didn't speak to Samaritans because they were out of favor with each other. But also she's a woman, so he shouldn't be talking to her. Or I guess he could be demanding something of her, but that's not how it goes. He asks her for a drink, and then they get into a conversation. And he's asking her about her, but she's sort of, I don't want to say she's being cagey, but she wasn't saying everything about herself. And then he says to her, he says that she had had 5 husbands, and the man that she is with now is not her husband. That's all he says, but he says that. And he says that to her, I believe, so that she realizes that he knows things about her, so that are very unique to her, very important to her, personal to her, so that she realizes that he's more than just this man who showed up at the well. He's not judging her in that sentence. He's just identifying that. And then she starts asking him questions about, you're Jews and we're Samaritans, and we're told that this is where God is, and you guys say this is where God is. So you say God's in Jerusalem. We say that God is on Mount Gerizim. And Jesus basically says, well, God's everywhere. And so, you shouldn't be debating that. However, she then says something about, the Messiah. And he says, I am he, and reveals himself to her. Now, this is early in John's Gospel, so as far as we can tell, this is the first time Jesus has ever told anyone that he is from God. He is God, because this is John's way when he uses these I am phrases. He's echoing what we read in Exodus in the Hebrew scriptures, where God says, I am. When asked, what is your name? He says, I am. I am, basically, I am who I am. And that is what John uses over and over again to identify Jesus revealing who he is. And he does this first with her. She runs to her city, her town, her village, to tell everybody about this Jesus. And she believes he's the Messiah. She explains why. And apparently people believe her. Then the disciples show up, and then it goes on after that, but basically they're very concerned that he was talking to this Samaritan woman, and then it follows from there.
Mm-hmm. So we have really 2 lines of scripture that have been used to sully this woman's reputation. The first one is, it says, and it was noon. Right? So this encounter happened at noon. Jesus is at the well. She shows up with her water jug, and it is noon. And many people have preached about how that indicates that she must have been some kind of outcast. She didn't go to the well with the other women who likely would have gone earlier in the day when it was cooler, but she had to go later, when it was hot out, so that she could avoid the whispers and the jeers from the other women. Except it says nothing like that in the passage. It simply says, it was noon.
Can I make a confession at this point?
I think you should.
I have preached a sermon like that because I had been taught that was exactly what that story was supposed to be telling us.
Yeah, that's what the commentaries say, isn't it?
It is. Older commentaries, not so much newer comments about this passage.
Mm. And then we have Jesus saying to her that she had 5 husbands, and the husband that she's with now is not her husband, and that statement points to the fact that she must be a loose, immoral, fallen woman to have been with so many men. But
because she divorced all those men and remarried, and now she's living in sin because she's not even married to the guy.
But did she divorce all those men?
We don't know that.
Well, I'll tell you what I suspect. I suspect she did not, because if you look at the time and the place, it was men who had control over these things. A man could write a certificate of divorce and divorce his wife very easily and just move on. A woman did not have that same ability and was much less likely to want to end a relationship where she had the protection of a husband, because women on their own were very vulnerable economically. If they did not have a family to take them back in, a brother or a father who was willing to support them, they were in real trouble. So what's more likely is that her husband's died, possibly abandoned her. Maybe they divorced her, but it's really unlikely that she initiated the ending of those relationships.
It is interesting, though, how people early in history and throughout history have filled in that gap and made the story up that, well, she must have divorced all these people. Or maybe she was so horrible that they just all had to keep divorcing her. But that all of that is absent from the text. There's nothing there that says anything like that. All Jesus says is she's had 5 husbands. There are other stories in Scripture where women have had multiple husbands, and it wasn't their fault. It was just, their husband died, and the woman who ends up with how many of the brothers as her husbands, basically an echo of this story, which is one brother she marries, he dies, so then because of the way the tradition was, to protect her, another brother married her, and then he died. And boy, you would have thought eventually she would have found a different family to marry into, because these guys were not in a good gene pool, I guess. But the reality is that we have no idea what her circumstances are, but we read into that she must have been doing something immoral, and therefore that's why she had so many husbands. And
notice that it's immoral, right?
Yes.
Not just that she was an unpleasant person who got, divorced, but that she was immoral. That she had done something sinful, and there's a sexual undertone in that.
The only thing I could figure that maybe was the reason why she got divorced so many times was the same reason that she challenged Jesus right in that moment and started asking these deep questions. Maybe she was too smart and she was just challenging the men in her life too much.
Kind of like your wife?
Yeah, maybe. I wouldn't say that ever, though.
No, I'm sure you wouldn't. But you know what else this brings to my mind is that often when we go through hardship in life, when we go through tough times, that's when we reach out for God. That's when we often experience the most spiritual growth. And I wonder if, in fact, what Jesus was pointing out is that woman's had a difficult life. She, for whatever reason, has had multiple relationships that have broken down. That's hard. And notice that her response is not to make excuses for herself. It's not to flinch and pull away. It's to start asking theological questions. And possibly because she's been through those difficult times, she has grown in wisdom and understanding. And so now she has God, the Messiah, with her. And so she is taking advantage of that and asking the important questions.
I think you're hitting on something that is I found important about this passage in Scripture. We have this focus on her as this, again, fallen woman, this person who, would have been there because she was embarrassed or she was ashamed. The Scripture doesn't say anything like that. Instead, what we miss then by focusing on that is this exchange they actually have, one of deep respect, one of dignity, one of care for each other. And that should have been something that should have struck everybody. Oh my gosh, what a difference, that was relative to what normally might have happened at the well at that time between two people in those circumstances. So we miss out on this whole Christ perspective, this, what Jesus is doing there that is so radically different. And then we miss out on that because we're focused on the wrong things.
Mm-hmm. And I think if anything, she stands out to me as a good disciple of Jesus and an evangelist. I mean, she has the confidence to go to her city and tell people about him.
No offense to Peter, because he is, I think a very loyal, faithful disciple. But he doesn't ask these deep questions. At least we don't see that anywhere in the Gospels. She ends up asking the deep questions and having this very authentic conversation with Jesus that we don't see. I mean, when the disciples show up, all they're asking him is, what do you mean? Where'd you get your food? Or how? Just very basic questions that were not so deep. And here she's the one. She has this very long conversation with him that we don't see with any of the other disciples or anybody else really in Scripture. Right. So I think we miss all of that because we're so focused on the fact that she had 5 husbands and now she's living with a guy. We don't even know what that situation is because there's no description about that. There's no detail about what's happened there. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's as you said, it is an illustration of how we have misinterpreted Scripture throughout centuries.
And how quickly we have been to condemn women.
Always.
Yeah. And interestingly, in the Eastern Church, she has been given the name Photina, and that means enlightened one. And where Jacob's Well is, in Nablus, in the West Bank, there has been a church that's been built over and around Jacob's Well, and the name of that church is Saint Faustina. So, Photina, sorry. So the church is named after her. So there is a certain segment, I think, of Christian tradition who has recognized her as an enlightened one, as somebody who has a positive character, and not this fallen woman that so many of us have been taught about.
I know we spoke earlier about how this Scripture and the one we were talking about from Genesis chapter 2 and 3 have affected women throughout history, as though it's only been in the church, but it is something that is translated throughout history, throughout societies, regardless. I would say because of the Genesis story, we're talking about Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right, who would use that as their scripture and their guidance around, the creation stories. So we're talking about a lot of people in history who were affected by this and who followed those similar teachings, right? And the impact on women has been dramatic for a very long time. And the subjugation of women, which is what we talked about also when we were talking about that Genesis story, that dominance of patriarchy, right, which was attributed to the same passage of Scripture where it says, you're supposed to, have your husband dominate you, right? From a story that we believe is a mythical story, which was really representative more of the time than it was about a teaching from God.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't think the passage actually says we should be dominated, we women should be dominated by our husbands, but it is an acknowledgement that that is what the experience was at the time. Yeah.